This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 456, part 2, entitled The Masculisting of Men from a Future Global Historical Perspective. So, carrying straight on. Masculists then threatened women with MGTOW tactics that if women did not fib up and vote with men for the men fairing of the gender laws, in brackets, which included the legislation of the that's paternity rejection right, the lack of which at the time caused masculists to claim was the greatest form of gender discrimination that exists, since women had the that's maternity rejection right, but men had no so women had the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, but men didn't. So millions of women could lie to their boyfriends/husbands that they were taking the pill, but weren't, got pregnant, then forced him to pay for a kid he didn't want, manslaving him for decades, a major gender crime as seen by the masculists. Close brackets. Then such women would be punished by men, by masculists, by not getting one, forcing women to be manless, sexless, loveless, babyless, and spat at for being manslaving parasites, hated by men, by masculists, who saw such women as manslavers, a war issue for the masculists. Masculist ideas spread across the planet, particularly in the English-speaking and in European countries. Young women were noticing that boyfriend after boyfriend refused to give them their sperm, because these young men refused to face a 1 in 4 chance of losing his kids in a hated, fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce court. The masculists label the feminists controlling the divorce courts fluffy feminist hypocrites, because these feminists kept their traditional fluffy expectations of men, and were hypocrites because these feminists wanted equal rights with men in the parliaments, but rejected equal obligations with men in sharing out equally the burden of earning the living by not bothering to fip up. These fluffy feminist hypocrites wanted their cake and to eat it too. Millions of masculists grew to hate the fluffy feminists who controlled the divorce courts and castigated them in public. Masculists also gender politically harangued feminists who knew nothing about masculist ideas, labelling them monoconscious feminists. That is, a feminist who has only had her feminist consciousness raised, so is not bi-conscious. That is, has had both her feminist and her masculist consciousnesses raised. Feminists had had a monopoly over gender politics for 60 years at the time, so it came as a real shock for them to suddenly be confronted by very angry, hateful masculists who harangued them publicly with masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric, telling these monoconscious feminists that they were MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, who did not see that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, with their decades-lasting manslaving parasitism. So had a powerful moral obligation to fip up and help men to men-fair the gender laws. Young women were increasingly panicked as they could no longer persuade young men to get them pregnant. So became an easy target for the masculist strategists, telling these young women to hate the fluffy feminists who controlled the divorce courts, since these fluffy feminist hypocrites were the root cause for these young women's babylessness. So over the years, young women, scared of not getting a boyfriend and someone to help them raise the kids they wanted, poured into math and the sciences at high school, pushed by the masculists with slogans like "No calculus, no baby," "Fib up or be manless." By the end of the decade of the 2020s, masculist ideas were mainstream, spread via the mass media and the internet, so that millions, later billions of men were infected by the masculist virus, who became conscious that their traditional male role of working for a woman for decades of his life was in fact manslavery, since a woman has a career window of half a century. So if she doesn't share the burden equally of earning the living, then she is a fluffy, man-slaving parasite who deserves to be cast out of society, be socially and sexually rejected by men as vermin. This horrific threat coming from the masculists terrified young women when they faced extremely angry men pushing them to fip up or not get a man, be spat at and brutally rejected by men as hated manslavers. The masculists then took a page out of the feminist political agenda and pushed hard for the establishment of gender equality committees in the parliaments, which consisted half of female feminists and half of male masculists, whose aim was to address equally both sets of gender political issues, that is, feminist and masculist. The male masculists in these committees then set out their political manifesto, which included such obvious things to masculists, namely reform of the divorce courts, legislating the para, pushing young women to fip up or not get a man, removing across the board legally based discriminations against men, increasing salaries for male primary and secondary school teachers so that little boys could have male role models, promoting men's studies courses at the universities, etc. Over the years, society accepted the idea that gender oppression was a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men far worse than vice versa due to women's decades-lasting man-slaving parasitism of men. As this happened, the feminist movement then split over the issue of its attitudes towards masculist ideas, which by that time were as well known and as widespread as feminist ideas. The more traditional, less open-minded feminists, who remained monoconscious, clashed with the biconscious feminists. The monoconscious feminists saw the biconscious feminists as traitors selling out to men, and the biconscious feminists saw the monoconscious feminists as bigots who blindly refused to see the reality that fluffies are manslavers who commit a far more serious gender crime against men than does a man who rapes a woman, since manslavery lasts decades, enslaving a man for decades. The biconscious feminists strongly criticised the monoconscious feminists, claiming that monoconscious feminism would destroy the feminist movement because it would be seen by most of society as bigoted and hence would lose support and die, which is what it eventually did. That is, the monoconscious feminists pretty well died out, not taken seriously by most people of both sexes, who by then were well informed of both feminist and masculist ideas. Young male masculists at high school put enormous moral pressure on young women to fip up, to get career-competent educations, and benefited from the new legislation pushed by the masculists in the gender equality committees to make the teaching of calculus compulsory in 11th and 12th grades of high school, as it was in the old Soviet Union. Young women were deeply scared of not getting a man due to not fipping up, so chose the career-competent majors for the most part. Any young woman who didn't suffered greatly, since she quickly earned a reputation within her social circle of being a fluffy, and hence was given the kiss of death in terms of getting a man. The young men told each other that that girl was a fluffy, so young men crossed her off as a potential girlfriend, since young men did not want to be manslaved for decades by a despised bloody fluffy. Thus most women became real FIPs, and this made the reform of the divorce courts and the legislation of the para much easier, since with nearly all women as FIPs expecting to have a career for half a century of their lives, the traditional model of divorce, that is, in which the ex-husband pays for the fluffy ex-wife, died out. Both sexes were expected to be and were career competent, were FIPs. Once the gender laws were men-fared, often after quite bitter struggles, for example the legislation of the para, which saw the fluffies combine forces and then fought tooth and nail to oppose its legislation, but in time were overruled by the majority of society when the female masculists combined with the male masculists to vote for it. Young women voted strongly for the para, since if they didn't, then their potential boyfriends would label them a hated fluffy manslaver, so that her chances of ever having a baby were dashed. She would be unable to ever persuade a quality man to impregnate her. As the politically active masculists gradually got the masculist legislation and rights that they wanted, their anger and hatred against the fluffy and fluffy feminists subsided. Against the fluffies and fluffy feminists subsided, since masculism had largely won the day. The number of fluffies and monoconscious feminists simply dwindled away to zero, so feminism and masculism largely just slowly disappeared into the sunset, forgotten about and ignored, except for people like me, that is, a historian of gender roles of the 20th and 21st centuries. That era was fascinating for its passions and bitter ideological debates, but are seen as irrelevant in the late 21st century, as were the religious debates between the Catholics and the Protestants in the 17th century. Both major historical debates are now just that, historical debates, that few people care about now, since nowadays men and women live largely identical lives. Sure, women grow the kids and get a motherhood wage from the government, but that is only for a few years, in brackets, typically 6 years in many countries, and then return to their careers, sharing the burden of earning the living equally with men, not expecting to manslave them the way their female ancestors did. Thus, in the 1970s, women liberated themselves from being bored housewives and became female careerists. And in the 2020s, men liberated themselves from being manslaves to women by forcing women to fip up or not get a man. So women did. Now the very concept of gender has pretty well died out, except for the genetically determined differences between the sexes. But in terms of daily lifestyles, there's very little difference between the two sexes. If the masculists of the early 2020s could look into a crystal ball and see society in my era, they would take heart that they will achieve in the future all the social, political and legislative goals that they set out to accomplish. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 450 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.